I want to bring in Jeff Mason and Tom Joscelyn. Jeff is a White House correspondent for Reuters, and Tom is a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and senior editor of the FDD's Long War Journal. Welcome to you both. Tom, let me start with you. The president said he stands firmly behind his decision to withdraw U.S. forces from Afghanistan. He also blamed the Afghan forces, what he said was lack of will to fight. What's your take on that?
Well, I'd be very careful with that argument that the White House is putting out for this reason. We've documented that thousands and thousands of Afghans have died over the last year and 18 months fighting on the front lines. The truth of the matter is that when the Taliban launched its May 1st offensive, the Afghan forces had already been hollowed out. So basically, they were preparing for this onslaught very far in advance, and they knew exactly what they were doing. And basically, by the time they pushed the button on May 1st to launch this offensive, they had already basically prepared the ground for victory. And so in our view, it looks like the Afghan forces were actually defeated some time ago. And in fact, when they launched this offensive on May 1st, what you can find out is that they had already bought off some of the remaining commanders. They had bribed some of the remaining commanders. They had already cajoled some of the remaining commanders to basically let them walk over the territory. And that was, there are many reasons for that, but one of them is that they had already softened up Afghan forces greatly. Since 2014, I think, more than 45,000 Afghans died on the front, battling the jihadists. So I think we have to keep that in mind here. But it's true, at the end of the day, there was a failure on the Afghans' part as well. But there was also a failure by the U.S. military leadership that really did not understand how dire the situation was.
And Jeff, President Biden said much of this outcome has to do with the Trump administration's original exit strategy. Can you touch more on that, as well as former President Trump's original plan for Afghanistan?
Well, what President Biden is saying there is saying on some level that President Trump tied his hands. And what he has repeated a few times is that he had a choice between going ahead with the deadline that President Trump had set and the agreement that was made with the Taliban, and withdrawing all the troops, or putting more troops back in. And this President Biden, just wasn't going to do that. He wasn't going to put more troops back in. But he did, in terms of President Trump's initial plan, Elaine, I mean, he at one point had suggested having talks with the Taliban at Camp David. That, of course, didn't end up happening. But his plan, ironically, at least his intention, was to do very much in some ways what President Biden has done now, which is to take all the troops out. I'm sure he would probably argue that he would have had a different plan for actually how to execute it. But in general, the goals are the same. And that's why it's interesting that, of course, there's a lot of criticism coming against President Biden right now from Republicans. But their former leader, President Trump, was also fully in support of taking the U.S. troops out of that country.
Yeah, that was going to be my question, Jeff, is what has been the response now on Capitol Hill? We've seen, for instance, on social media, lawmakers on both sides of the aisle tweeting about, if you need help and need to get out of Afghanistan, contact our office and we will attempt to help you. There is a sense of desperation. But, as you point out, and as others have pointed out, Afghanistan policy is the product of decades of both Republican and Democratic leaders' actions. So what have we been hearing from lawmakers now?
Well, you're absolutely right to say that it's been a product of 4 different administrations. And I've been speaking to some former government officials over the last few days who have identified some of the missteps that have been made under multiple administrations, including at the very beginning under President Bush, for essentially taking the U.S. eye off the ball in Afghanistan after the decision to invade Iraq. But in terms of lawmaker reaction now, Elaine, it's mixed. I mean, it depends on who you're listening to. Certainly, one major voice on the Republican side who's a supporter of President Trump is Senator Lindsey Graham. And I believe he was quoted in Ouija's piece earlier saying that this is all Biden's fault and that it did not need to be this way. You have Democrats saying we need to support Afghans and we need to support the people who helped us. And so I think that there will be bipartisan criticism there against the administration for not being swifter at helping the many Afghans who are now trying to get out of the country, along with U.S. diplomats and U.S. citizens.
Tom, there's been some suggestion that the Taliban are saying they want to form a quote unquote an inclusive Islamic government. What are you hearing, and are they doing anything to work toward that right now? What would that even look like as far as a government?
Well, to give your viewers a sense of what I do, I follow the Taliban every day of my life for the last 15 plus years. They are obviously going to announce the restoration of their Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. This is an authoritarian regime. It is not an inclusive government in any Western sense of that term. They've learned very effectively how to parrot certain Western ideas and concepts and phrases, and then people sort of parrot them and they don't realize that they're just talking nonsense, basically. And so what you're going to see is that they're going to announce the restoration of their Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, which is what they've been fighting for all along. But if I may just take 1 second to hammer home a point that Jeff was so correct about, which is that the deal that President Trump and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo signed in Doha with the Taliban on February 29th, 2020, that was really the death blow to Kabul and the Afghan government. When you go back through all this, you'll see at the time I was harshly critical of that deal. And the reason were multiple reasons. One, the Afghan government was locked out of that process. Two, the U.S. was pursuing a fanciful peace process between the Taliban and Afghan government after that, when the Taliban had no desire for real peace. They only were going to fight for victory for their Islamic Emirate. What that meant was that the Afghans spent the last year plus fighting for a draw, while the Taliban and al-Qaeda were fighting for victory. That was deadly, a deadly mistake. But also, President Trump and Secretary Pompeo did something that was really disgraceful. They portrayed the Taliban as America's counterterrorism partner. Secretary Pompeo went actually on CBS and one of the morning shows and said that the Taliban had agreed to fight alongside us and destroy al-Qaeda. Totally false. That's not true. There's no evidence that happened. President Trump said that the Taliban was now going to be killing terrorists for us and was now actually our de facto partner in what was formerly known as the War on Terror. If you're an Afghan commander in the field and you see America capitulate like this to the Taliban and roll over, it's devastating. It basically, this deal that the Trump administration signed in Doha in February 2020 was absolutely the death knell for the Afghan government.
So, I'm glad you brought that up, because it's something that I think people may not understand, sort of the connection between that moment in February of 2020 and what was directly then perceived by those commanders, by all of those on the front lines in far-flung districts who were maybe not in Kabul. What was the message that was sent to those people who may have been in a position and had been willing to resist any kind of Taliban advances once they saw that the government of Afghanistan was not a party to those negotiations?
Well, actually, in the last few days, there's been some excellent reporting in the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal and elsewhere documenting how the Taliban, after that deal was signed, went to commanders in the field and the remaining commanders in the field and said, look, America just surrendered. That they've capitulated. They're not going to fight us. So why are you going to fight us? Why are you going to hold out when your patron is leaving and is capitulate to us, and said that in fact we're their counterterrorism partner, that they now trust us more than they trust you. That's exactly the message that the Afghans received. And so, I'm not going to whitewash the Afghans' performance here. There was a lot of corruption. There was a lot of incompetence. There were a lot of problems here with the ANDSF, which was the Afghan Army and Security Forces that were stood up by the U.S. military. But that deal on February 29th of 2020 did a tremendous amount of damage to the Afghans' cause, and it had ripple effects that went right through the current days and current hours that we're seeing right now. So when I hear the Republican lawmakers, chastising President Biden, I mean, I get it. I think that this withdrawal has been handled in a very haphazard manner and chaotic manner. But the bottom line is, this is, as Jeff said, a bipartisan failure going back across 20 years, across 4 administrations. Right from the get-go, President Bush made mistakes, and it just seems like America's leaders made one mistake after another.